All right, welcome to the Football Outsiders Radio Hour, first edition, not on the radio and possibly more than an hour, but we're here to talk football on Twitch and then archived for various purposes in various places to be determined. So I'd like to welcome all of our Twitch viewers to the Football Outsiders Radio Hour. We're going to be doing this every Thursday from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock Eastern Time. And my guest today, you know them from Football Outsiders. Scott Spratt, our fantasy expert, is here. Mike Tanier is here, draft expert, did all those grades for all the picks from rounds 1 through 3 last Thursday. So we're going to be reviewing the draft, talking about who had a good draft, who had a bad draft, going through the whole thing, all 7 rounds. I mean, not round by round because that would be boring. But just talking about which teams did well and which teams did badly, and I'm apparently muted. Oh. Hi. I apparently had muted myself, which is bad. And now you can hear me. Everybody can hear me. Well, everybody heard me on Twitch, but not on Zoom. That was the complication. But here we are on Zoom now. And here my guests are. Scott, say hello.
How's it going, Aaron?
Mike, say hello.
Great to be here. Always a few technical difficulties as we try to figure out this new technology that has existed for about 16 years.
Oh,
Here's
brave.
Three old guys using social media. This will just begin.
Brave new world that has such social media in it. All right. Let's talk about the draft. Mike, do you have a particular team that stands out to you as having had a really good draft or a really bad draft, using the whole thing, not just, we did the first round on our big show last Thursday night, but talking about the whole draft.
At the risk of giving a really obvious answer, I'm as excited about the Bears and everything they did, even going beyond, getting their quarterback, as I think a lot of people are along the way. And in later rounds, I got more and more enthusiastic about what the Giants were doing. In fact, I sent some emails out. It's like, well, what's the Giants projection? What's the Giants projection after this draft? And it was kind of like, oh, yeah, that's right. They're still the Giants. But they're the Giants now with a good draft class. And that's a good thing. And I think we talked on Thursday night about the Saints. I'm still wondering what the Saints are doing, what the Saints' plan is, if the Saints are in denial about the fact that, not only is Drew Brees retired, but all of their defense would be like us trying to unmute things on Twitch here with our gray beards. I think the youngest guy on their defense is Malcolm Jenkins. And they went out there through the entire draft and they got a bunch of project defensive players. And then they threw Ian Book in as like, oh, here's a quarterback that can sit between Jameis and Taysom Hill and kind of bring in like sort of the worst of both of them.
The reviews on Ian Book are really bad. Like everybody out there who does draft analysis hated that pick and thought he was taken way too early.
I was kind of sanguine about him in that I had him in my mind as the 6th round guy who has a little bit of that Taysom Hill in him, where if you have him running around in the 4th quarter of the preseason game, you're going to be like, oh yeah, well, we could do something. He can be the pepper pot to win a game or two. But like the overall skill set is this guy's never going to be a starter. This guy. So if you're getting him because you want to back up Lamar Jackson or something like that, I can see that. If the idea is, well, here's our insurance policy. Yeah, your insurance policy is you got a weaker Taysom Hill to back up Taysom Hill with Jameis in there doing whatever. So that was a weird pick for a team that, like, pick after pick seemed to be acting like, hey, everything's fine. We're 13-3 as usual, and we're going to do what we always do.
Yeah, that Peyton Turner pick in the first round, we all attacked the Raiders for taking Alex Leatherwood way earlier than conventional wisdom suggested. But the Saints did the same thing. Peyton Turner was not really projected to go in the top 50 by anybody. We had forgotten to even do a sack seer projection on him for our edge rusher projections because his pro day came so late and he wasn't really considered a top pick. So we just sort of forgot to put him in the article.
I mean, I think there was a thought leading into the draft that there was going to be a little bit more volatility than usual given the opt-outs and everything else going on. But Mike, I don't actually think that played out by and large, right? So is that why these sort of oddball picks sort of stand out?
I think there is a degree to that. I think that there was like a variety of discrepancies. It looked like some teams were grabbing guys that they saw play 8, 9, 10 games, even if they were second tier guys, or that they saw in the Senior Bowl. Like we saw him in the Senior Bowl, he's in shape. We interview him. He seems like a good guy. Let's roll. Some teams were doing that. Then we had other teams that I'm pretty sure Urban Meyer was just drafting off of his recruiting wish list from 3 or 4 years ago. So you can't like say, oh, the NFL did this, the NFL did that. I think on a team by team basis, teams did that. But Peyton Turner, when I do my prep, I'll do like the edge rushers, and then I'll do the defensive tackles, and then like I got to make sure that I grab the actual defensive ends, like the guys who are just like a defensive end, the one who's going to turn out to be, your sort of your Trey Flowers type of guy who's like, oh, he can line up all over the place. He's not just wide nine going in there. And I think Peyton Turner was in that list. So I did my prep on him and I looked at him and it's like, oh, Tracy McToolsy guy, out there being really tall, being really elongated. And these are guys that teams that are 12-4, 13-3, they always grab him. Because like, oh yeah, we can put him on the bench and let him gain 25 pounds or teach him this technique, that technique. That's not who the Saints are now. I know I was looking at the projections are coming out. It looks like we still have a good projection on the Saints. They don't look to me like the team that can say, oh, we can fool around in this draft.
Yeah, just to give people a little bit of a preview, we're working on the initial projections for Football Outsiders Almanac, and they love the Saints defense. Love the Saints defense. So we end up, if projecting Winston as the starter at quarterback, we end up still projecting the Saints as a playoff team. I think if I used Taysom Hill as the quarterback, we would not be projecting the Saints as a playoff team. And I have no idea what's going through Sean Payton's mind. I don't know which I don't know whether he wants to continue to futz around with Taysom Hill or whether he's going to go with the quarterback who, listen, I knew he threw a lot of interceptions 2 years ago, but Jameis Winston is a professional National Football League quarterback who can throw the ball down the field. Like, I don't think there's any question. If you want to ask, how does New Orleans make the playoffs this year? It starts with starting Jameis Winston at quarterback instead of Taysom Hill.
I mean, not to be flippant, but didn't Jameis turn a top 5 DVOA defense in the Buccaneers into a non-playoff team? And then Brady inherits that team and takes them to the Super Bowl the next year?
That's true. They
just may not have a great option, honestly.
But it's just interceptions are so inconsistent from year to year. I just don't think Winston throws 30 of them again, right? I mean, it's more likely that he goes back to what he did every other year except 2019 and throws like 16 of them, which is not good, but not terrible. And at least he can get the ball downfield, unlike Taysom Hill.
There has to be a hope that Sean Payton would be able to work with him and maybe hide some of the weaknesses. I mean, he's basically gotten a lot out of guys like Drew Brees that maybe weren't considered to be the top of their tier prospects with obvious limitations. And I'm guessing that probably relates to the Ian Book selection as well, as maybe he has a little bit better chance with that coaching staff than he would have in your generic NFL team that drafted him.
Yeah, but you still, if you can wait to take a guy in the 7th round, you wait to take him in the 7th round,
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
These guys drafted Garrett Grayson a couple of years ago, very, very high. So they kind of like what they like there. I mean, Scott, you would know the supporting cast better than anybody, I guess, in New Orleans. After Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara, guess what? It's like the number 3 option would normally be, I think Taysom Hill is your slot guy or is your whatever.
Waiting
guy.
for the Traquan Smith breakout that we've been waiting for 3 years.
Marquez Callaway, maybe. I mean, there's guys with potential, but you're right. The offense isn't exactly like, I don't know.
It's not stacked. Is a tight end. I see Nick Vada. Adam Troutman, who I like, but we all like the small school tight end. Everyone loves a small school tight end. They're delightful. And then they wind up being Dallas Goedert or whatever, and they're a good, decent number 2 tight end. The guys at Football Guys, what do they say? The law of rational coaching. The law of rational coaching says that Jameis, of course, will win the starting job. Well, the law of rational coaching said that Jameis would be the backup last year when Drew Brees was hurt and Taysom was the backup. So I will believe the law of rational coaching when I see that Sean Payton is going to be rational about the fact that Drew Brees is gone.
Right. I mean, I guess there's doing initial projections. I had to ask myself, who's going to start in Houston and who's going to start in New Orleans? And I went with the downside in Houston and the upside in New Orleans, but maybe it's going to end up being the downside in New Orleans. I don't think it's going to end up being the upside in Houston.
I don't think there is an upside in Houston right now.
That's another draft that everybody hated, by the way.
Yeah. And I don't blame them. I was actually looking at the draft report cards on Football Outsiders. Who was that? Kale Clinton did for us.
Yeah, doing our annual compilation of everybody else's report cards. And Houston was by far the most hated draft by everybody.
And that starts with, of course, they don't have any draft picks. So if I'm doing grades, a lot of times I look at it and say, okay, we're not going to just keep failing you for these horrible trades a regime ago, although, maybe that's justified to a degree, but what do you do with it now? And it was the Kobayashi Maru. It's like, what do you do you have to get some kind of solution at quarterback. And once you take care of that sort of solution at quarterback, in case this Deshaun Watson situation looks like it's going to happen, then you can't do anything else because you traded all the draft capital. So, I see a big F there. I see like a lot of C's and D's in the grades. And it makes perfect sense, but it's a hopeless cause situation down there. I'll tell you, from my personal standpoint, I do not want to talk about that team. I don't want to I want to quietly ignore that team, and I think probably a lot of us do until we know more about what's going on. Because right now it's an embarrassment on levels that we don't even want to address.
Yeah, Cochlea points out in the comments that hopefully Houston doesn't add the Chargers medical staff because then that would be the worst of both worlds. I think the problem with Houston is I don't diss on them for the quarterback that they took in the third round, taking Davis Mills, third round. Obviously, there's a lot of questions around the positions. He was a guy most people thought would go around third round. Fine.
Right.
I guess top of fourth, not third, late third, or top of fourth, top of third. Anyway,
third.
The problem was that they kept trading their picks away to take other guys. They traded 2 other picks to move 20 spots for Nico Collins, a wide receiver that nobody thought was super falling or anything.
Oh.
And then they traded another 2 picks to move up to 170 to take a linebacker named Garrett Willow in the 5th round. And if you think about one of the precepts of analytics is we know less than we think we do about which college prospects are going to succeed in the NFL, right? I'm not going to go as far as to say that no one knows anything and the draft is completely random. But certainly, I think one of the analytics precepts is we know less than we think we do. We're not as smart as we think we are. And that suggests don't trade away extra picks to move up for guys except for quarterbacks.
Right.
And the fact that this is a team that has holes all over the roster and they traded away picks that they need to build that roster because they really feel like these guys are the guys. But the odds that Nico Collins is going to be a star are no better than any other third-round wide receiver. And they're not that much better than whatever wide receiver they would have taken 20 picks later. And they gave up a couple more bites at the apple in order to get him. That's what I don't like about Houston's draft. It's not just that they had no picks. Seattle came in with 3 and used 3. Houston came in with 8 and used 4. 5. Used 5.
And I don't like Collins that much as a prospect. I think I commented on Football Outsiders. It's I've seen the big Michigan receiver before. I've seen them before, and they wind up being Devin Funchess or whatever. You don't want to program scout or whatever, but here he comes. He's a big body. He was a great recruit coming out. Oh, he looks like he's got pretty good footwork. He's not particularly fast. He doesn't have good production. And now I'm looking at the depth chart. And Scott, you can speak to this maybe. They have about 30. They're adding him to a depth chart with 25 free agent acquisitions and a couple of incumbents there. I don't see even why they would have prioritized Nico Collins there.
Well, see, that's actually the reason why I don't like the Davis Mills draft pick. And I'm not going to pretend I can evaluate these quarterbacks at all, but this team, in my mind, is either going to have Deshaun Watson or they're going to have one of the top 2 or 3 picks in next year's draft, right?
Yeah.
What does Mills have to do for the team not to draft the top quarterback prospect in next year's draft? I feel like they may be throwing that pick away because it's so obvious that they're going to have to readdress the position again next season.
That's true, because in order for Davis Mills, we have to have Watson not come back. We have to have Tyrod Taylor be so bad that they give Mills over half a year starting. And then Mills has to be so good that you're not going to take the top quarterback prospect in next year's draft. It's really unlikely.
They should have been good.
If he does what Justin Herbert did last year, then okay. But Herbert was the number 6 pick in the draft.
Yeah,
it's not exactly apples and apples.
No, that's not it. They should have been the moment that the Bears got a quarterback. They should have been on the phone. Nick Foles, get us Nick Foles. He can come in, do the aw shucks routine and everything. If chaos is ensuing on the other side of things, we'll stink. We'll spend the money on stinking, but we'll have a guy who during the press conferences won't melt down, etc. And that would be fine. Maybe they did. Maybe Nick Cesario did that, and Jack Easterby was burning incense and doing stuff.
I feel like Tyrod Taylor is already that guy. They don't need Nick Foles to be that guy because Tyrod Taylor is already the guy that you can respectably lose with.
Yeah. There's a faceless franchise element thing you have to put into play when you're talking about Houston with the Watson situation, etc. So having Opie out there might have been something useful to them.
Yeah, that's true. You talked about drafts you liked. Let's go back to drafts you liked. So Chicago, the only downside I think of the Chicago draft, like everybody feels the move for Justin Fields was the best move that any team made in the entire draft, and I am not going to disagree with that. I think the only problem I have is because of the guys they traded away, the picks they traded away to do Fields and Tevin Jenkins in the second round, they only had the 2 picks in the top 150. So the last couple picks they have are really throwaway random chance guys. And there are a lot of people out there who do analysis. Like, again, this is with the caveat that none of us really knows as much as we think we do right now. That's why draft grades end up in the long run turning out not to mean anything, like Benjamin Robinson did that research for us last year about do draft grades mean anything. But that being said, the people who do this analysis don't think Tevin Jenkins is a left tackle right away. Right. And the Bears went out and cut Charles Leno, and they're going to give this second rounder the left tackle job right away.
Right. I kind of like Daz Newsome, one of the later guys, but with all the caveats you said there, I watched a couple North Carolina games. I like Daz Newsome. Is he going to do this? Is he going to do that? So, yeah, I mean, and I see like A+ grades, and I might have been inclined to put an A+ grade on it based on that particular move. But it is one of those things where congratulations on painting yourself out of the corner. At great expense, you painted yourself out of the corner. You doubled down on Mitch Trubisky. He was the wrong choice. You tripled down. You added Opie, etc. And now you found an exit strategy from this. It cost you a ton of money. So it cost you a capital is what I should say. It's costing them money anyway because they're paying Dalton and Foles at this point. So was it a good pick overall? Yeah. Do I kind of like Jenkins? Yeah. But you can see if you do a full resource management type of thing, it wasn't necessarily a phenomenal draft. It was just a draft that gets them out of a bad situation. And remember, this is a team that still has like playoff bona fides. So replacing their quarterback while they still have a legitimate shot at saying, yes, we are a playoff team is a pretty good move.
I was driving somewhere this weekend and listening to NFL radio, and they said, what would Ryan Pace have to do to save his job? And they said, make the playoffs. And I thought, wait a minute. They already did that. Like, they made the playoffs last year. Like, making it as the 7th seed again isn't going to save anybody's job, right?
Right. I actually think that's the thing. This is a bigger, broader issue with the Bears that's not about this draft necessarily. I think ideally, when you have the quarterback like Fields that falls and becomes available, trading up to get him is an excellent idea if you think that Fields is going to be that guy. But they're trading up every year for players. I mean, sure, sometimes you get Khalil Mack or whatever, but if you're exiting every draft with only 4 or 5 prospects and even fewer in the first few rounds, then you're going to have roster holes. And the Bears have roster holes that they couldn't fill with just 2 picks in those top 150, like you mentioned.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you wind up spending money in unusual ways so you don't grab like the useful veteran because that money is spent elsewhere. I mean, Robinson's franchised now. Why? Why is Allen Robinson franchised? Why isn't he on a 4 or 5 year contract? Yeah. Maybe they couldn't get him. Maybe they can get him to sign one now. It's like, oh, I'm going to be working with Fields, but that doesn't make any sense. Why couldn't you get that one thing done? And they can't, and that's eating up money that they could use elsewhere.
You talked about the Giants draft. I think the thing that stands out to me about the later rounds of the Giants draft is that they took edge rushers that our Saxier system really likes. We really liked Ellerson Smith out of Northern Iowa as our big our pick for sleeper, and we really liked Azeez Ojulari, who they took in the second round. So, like, that's another thing. Not only did the Giants smartly trade down and accumulate more picks, including picks next year, but they took guys that our projection system liked.
Yeah, that's Ellerson G. Smith. You have to give him, he's like a billionaire aviator from the 1940s. Ellerson G. Smith from Northern Iowa, the pride of Northern Iowa. But yeah, he looked good. I saw the Saxier projection of him as a sleeper. I think he looked good on tape. What I saw of him, what I could project from Northern Iowa up to, the NFC East looked good. I really liked Azeez Ojulari. I think a lot of other folks at Football Outsiders liked him. I think a lot of people around the NFL liked him as the all-around, as I mentioned earlier, the all-around defensive end. Oh, he's not coming off the edge wide nine. He's going to get, 2.5 sacks, or he's going to get stoned all game. This is somebody who can drop into coverage for you. This is somebody who's going to defend the run for you. So I like those picks. And like you said, they got extra first-round picks next year. And we've never seen Dave Gettleman suddenly be the wizard of acquiring extra draft capital. Far from it. And yet those were, that was good. That could help this team in the long run as they try to continue to fill their holes that were caused by their draft mistakes of the past.
Right. Obviously, like for every other team in the NFL, a lot depends on Daniel Jones and whether he can take a big leap forward in his third year, which I think is unlikely because most players take big leap forward in their second year, not their third. But now we have to say this now till the end of time.
Josh Allen did it.
But Josh Allen did it.
Take a drink. Josh Allen, third year jump drinking game. Drew Lock, take a drink. Kyler Murray, take a drink.
Daniel Jones, take a drink. Dwayne Haskins, not so fast.
It could still happen. He's got another year.
Well, let me put my mask on first. Hold on. Okay.
I have a feeling J Molnar 94 in the chat says bad business, that he's talking about the Allen Robinson franchise tag that we were talking about. And CO the Legend asking if Robinson is more willing to stay now that Chicago has Fields. I would bet he's more willing to stay now that Chicago has Fields.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I mean, we don't know if Fields is going to be good, but the hype is there. I'll tell you another draft I liked and what they did after the draft. Baltimore. I think a lot of people are really high on the Baltimore draft. They like not only the first rounders, because we talked about first rounders last Thursday night, Rashad Bateman, the wide receiver from Minnesota, and Odafe, don't call me Jason Owe from Penn State, the edge rusher. But people really like Ben Cleveland. That's the guard they took in the third round with one of the Kansas City picks from the Orlando Brown trade. And they like Tylan Wallace, who's a wide receiver they took in the fourth. And I think they did a good job to take Shaun Wade, who's a cornerback who was really, really good 2 years ago and was considered a possible first-round pick. And then he just had a really bad off year. But he may have been struggling with injuries. And I love the idea of the sort of post-hype sleeper. Like in fantasy football, we call that the post-hype sleeper. Like the guy who was supposed to be really good a couple years ago and he wasn't. But you take a chance on the talent still being there. And the Ravens essentially drafted Shaun Wade as the post-hype sleeper, taking a chance that the talent that was there a couple years ago is still there. And I think that's a great gamble in the fifth round. And then they took a safety that they signed as an undrafted free agent named Ardarius Washington, who a lot of people thought was going to be drafted. Sports Info Solutions had him as their number 2 safety.
Wow.
In the Sports Info Solutions Prospect Handbook. And he went undrafted, and Baltimore ended up picking him up as an undrafted free agent. So that's a really nice addition to their secondary, along with Wade, and then Brandon Stevens, who's a cornerback they took in the third round.
I'll turn over to you, Scott. What do you see in terms of Bateman and Wallace? I guess both. It's the second year in a row they've taken two or three wide receivers. How do you see that shaking out in their offense?
I definitely like the Bateman pick a lot. Our own Derek Klassen, film analyst, kind of gave me the scoop that the offense up in Minnesota didn't have really great quarterback play, kind of was an RPO heavy scheme that maybe didn't highlight what Bateman did best. So I think he's a classic player that's probably going to be more successful in the NFL in the proper scheme than he was in college. So I think that probably helped him kind of fall a little bit later where the Ravens got him. Plus, I think he's kind of the perfect complement to the Ravens offense, where they have these field stretchers. They've got the bigger tight ends, but they didn't really have guys to work the middle of the field with the route running. That I think he's really going to fill a hole there, and probably beyond just his own fantasy value, which I think he's got some chance in year one, I think could really help Lamar Jackson kind of open it up a little bit as a passer.
Yeah, when you talk about a guy who was like a yak guy and was like a what do you call it, a RPO guy. Well, yeah, if you're at Minnesota and you're catching the slant off of the play action pass, well, it's Lamar.
Yeah,
it's going to be a play action freeze, slant, play action freeze, quick into the flatness, et cetera, and you're going to get yak from that. I can see that being very, very beneficial.
Yeah, slants for days.
Jay Molnar 94 says, eventually one of these Ravens receivers is going to hit, even if they have only 30 receptions all year. And I wonder if the problems they've had with receivers is there a problem with the development of receiver? I mean, I know you don't want to malign the Ravens coaching staff because we all feel like it's a really good coaching staff, but maybe there's a problem developing receivers. If these receivers don't develop either, then, you have to start asking questions, I think. But I'm going to give him a shot because everybody really liked Bateman.
Yeah, Hollywood, I was there 2019 for his, and he was injured constantly. So I don't even know what kind of offseason Hollywood had. And I think it was hurt chunk of the year. And then last year was 2020, and Lord knows what kind of, how well the coaching development went. Boykin, I'm not sure what the situation is there. He looked like a hero along the way. Duvernay, they used him as a reverses guy. But there is a little bit of, if you're not scratching the itches along the sidelines effectively, and Lamar was not doing that for big chunks of last season, it's going to take away some of the things you do at wide receiver, where everything either has to be like a crossing route of some kind, or it's a little bit up for grabs down the field.
Yeah,
so,
the numbers do have Baltimore throws in the middle of the field way more than any other team. And when I put that out on Twitter, someone came back with me that it was because of Mark Andrews, but the other teams with top tight ends do not throw in the middle of the field anywhere near as much as the Ravens do. It's much more about the Ravens scheme and Lamar Jackson's talents than it is about Mark Andrews, the fact that they throw in the middle of the field so much. Jay Molnar 94 points out that the old Ravens wide receiver coach just left and took a job with the Texans. So they have a new wide receiver coach in Baltimore this year. So
interesting. I was not aware.
Be positive. Speaking of the AFC North, let me ask you guys about Cleveland. Talking to Scott, and in a few minutes, we'll get to just sort of going through fantasy football. We're going to talk all about fantasy football value for all of the rookies taken in this draft, even those past the first round. But I want to ask about a specific guy, and that's Anthony Schwartz, because everything I've been reading about Anthony Schwartz is all over the place. Like, some people feel like he is just a gold mine waiting to happen, and others that he's just nothing but a gadget player with Olympic-style straight-line speed, but not field speed. So I don't even know, like, what kind of opportunities he's going to have in the Cleveland offense. But, like, a lot of people really like Cleveland's drafts, but I think there's questions about some of the players that they took, including Schwartz.
So I sort of think of Schwartz with that speed, as you mentioned. It's kind of like an NBA move where it's like he's kind of stretching a defense in a way that can help all of their other players. That's probably true of Marquise Brown, to tell you the truth, even though the Ravens haven't had other players to sort of take advantage. But he could help the team even if he's only getting 70 targets or whatever it is, a lower volume, where he won't be a real fantasy asset on his own. So I could sort of see that working out. And in my mind, taking him in the third round, 91st pick overall, that's probably a lot healthier place to take a quote unquote role player than it would be to take, Henry Ruggs kind of early in the first round when you're more or less looking for the same thing from the guy, right?
John Ross.
Yeah. That's a probably even better and more extreme example.
John Ross, I will point out, what if playmaker scores great mistakes?
He's on the Giants now. He's one of the 17 guys who are going to run deep and then have to come back for Daniel Jones's passes.
He's going to run deep so that Kadarius Toney can get open for a 1-yard bubble screen.
Yes.
The other guy is
for that.
Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah. So he finally went in the second round, and he went to Cleveland. And I guess he had heart issues. Is that why he dropped in the second round? And then there's questions about whether he's a tweener, whether he's a safety or a linebacker. I don't know. I feel like there's so many of these safety linebacker crossover players these days. Your Patrick Chung types that being a tweener between safety and linebacker isn't necessarily a bad thing.
It gets a little purple because I think JOK, he's a linebacker. I think he's a will linebacker. I think he's a pass rusher. That if you actually try to put him in some sort of slot role against a real slot wide receiver or a Kelsey type tight end, he's going to get burned up and down the field. The same with the young man Devon Diablo that the Raiders took as their latest like Mike Mayock Tracy Toolsy guy. But these guys they play these hybrid roles in college, and you'll see him out in the slot and then you'll see him rush the passer like 2 plays later. Like, oh my God, he's so versatile. He's a super weapon. He's a Swiss Army knife. He's the honey badger, and there's 73 honey badgers now. And there's one honey badger, and there's a couple of guys who can do that. So yeah, I think that was a heck of a pick. I think when he did drop, I was surprised. But at all places along the way, I said, this is a weak side linebacker. He can cover running backs, things like that. He can definitely rush the passer. But the idea that they're getting the latest, iteration of the positionless, Swiss Army knife, whatever, et cetera, can get a little bit purple sometimes.
This is another one where SIS's rookie handbook was really interesting because they had Owusu Koromoa as their number one outside linebacker.
Mm-hmm.
And they had Dylan Moses, number 2, higher than either Micah Parsons or Zaven Collins. And Dylan Moses didn't get drafted because of his knee issues.
Medicals.
Which is interesting. He went to Jacksonville, which, for all the questions we asked on the show last Thursday night about Jacksonville drafting Etienne at the end of the first round, a lot of the rest of the draft was medical guys, but whether it was signing Moses as undrafted or the second round tackle Walker Little, who's basically not played for 2 years because he opted out last year and then he had injury the year before.
Yeah. The tackle was a million-star recruit coming out at about the time that Urban Meyer was recruiting. And then he had an injury year and a COVID year. And I went back and I'm going to look at his sophomore year or whatever it was, freshman year film. And it's like, he's not ready in any way. He's a big, galoot who can move a little bit. So that's what you took. Dylan Moses was a gazillion-star recruit a couple of years ago.
Yep.
And he had injuries, and I thought he played very, very well. One of the problems this year with doing any kind of evaluations is usually that information about the medicals trickles out during the combine. This year it trickled out, Thursday afternoon or whatever. Like, you can't adjust to it. But, I think as an undrafted rookie, that's a potential hit. I love Moses. I saw him play last year, so he can play. And that's a potential hit. Getting out and getting these guys because they were great when you were recruiting 3 years ago. I've seen this game before. I've seen college coaches do it before, and I'm very concerned about how the Jaguars are approaching that.
Yeah. A reminder, by the way, if you're watching us on Twitch right now, feel free to ask questions in the chat. We'll take on any team you want to talk about. But otherwise, I think we're going to switch over and have a little bit more of a fantasy focus, and we're going to talk about fantasy prospects and scouting as well, but also fantasy prospects for all the skill players taken in this draft. Let's start out with the quarterbacks and playing this game called When Are They Going to Start? Trevor Lawrence and Zach Wilson right away. Justin Fields, when do you think he's going to start? What week would you think he's going to start?
Dude, I'll just throw out randomly, like in the 6 to 9 range, maybe whenever they're coming off the Bears bye week kind of era, which we don't know where that is yet, but I think it's going to be during this season, certainly, even though they have a competent passer in Andy Dalton. What do you think, Mike?
Did you just call Andy Dalton a competent passer?
He's one of DVOA's great success stories. Aaron always tells me this when I say, why did they draft somebody in the first round?
I was it's hard because I've been watching Cowboys tape. I'll be writing the Football Outsiders Almanac chapter on the Dallas Cowboys. So I've been watching some of their tape, watching some of their film. And I don't know if I'm watching COVID Andy or if I'm watching concussion Andy or if I'm just watching old Andy. But the competence of Andy Dalton seems to be, well, CeeDee Lamb's open a lot. Amari Cooper's open a lot. I don't see it. I don't see Andy Dalton as an upgrade over Nick Foles in any particular way. I call them Garfunkel and Oates because I think that's what you've got at this point with these two individuals. And I would be moving heaven and earth if I'm Nagy, if I'm Pace. I am moving heaven and earth to get Justin Fields ready to start week 1 and to just like jettison either of those guys to whichever team thinks they need mentor X at this point, because the dueling mentors, like dueling banjos thing is not going to work either. So now to what you're saying, there's a chance Fields isn't ready, A. B, there's a chance that if everybody's in save their job mode, they make like we're taking our time with the new prospect. We have to really make sure we nurture the new prospect. So then if they start the season 1-3, 1-4, and they've got to go back to the Hallis McCaskey clan and say, well, what happens? Like, well, it was a slow developing 2-year process. You've got to give us more time with the young man so you can kind of play that game. I'm not talking about real coaching. I'm talking about real coaching, the way these guys actually do these things to save their jobs. That's one way I can see them coming forward with starting the year with Dalton.
So one thing I'll say about both Fields and Trey Lance, who went number 3 to the 49ers, is even though they're the ones with the perceptions that they are going to need time to develop, both of them ran it quite a lot in college. Fields 29.6% rushing ratio, Lance 38.1%. And while that sort of seems kind of like a sort of not bad thing, but like a thing that's sort of counter to the development of a quarterback, I actually think in the modern game, that's extremely helpful because you can make positive plays and extend drives with your legs when maybe you don't understand what's happening with the defensive scheme against you, or maybe you're not ready to go through all of your progressions or whatever it is. You can take off and run, and that can work for you. And so I almost feel like even if they're not fully ready to go from a passing standpoint, maybe those are guys that can start immediately. And if that happens, obviously from a fantasy perspective, hugely valuable, because the rushing yards and the rushing touchdowns are just worth more points than the passing yards and passing touchdowns in most leagues.
Yeah, and the Bears have 11 offensive coordinators, so they can put together an option package mixed with a package of things that work. And I think Fields is reasonably far along. I don't think he's going to have a real progression problem. A little more worried about Lance. You're away from the game, 19 career starts, FCS, et cetera, et cetera. But there, again, we'll probably go into that, whether you think Garoppolo is going to start week one. But, Kyle Shanahan can't put together a boot rollout. That's all he does. He puts together boot rollout packages. He puts baby buggy bumpers and training wheels on offenses for all these guys. He did it for Manziel, for heaven's sakes. He's done it for guys like C.J. Beathard. These guys can do this, and exactly right. The fact that they're mobile means that your offense isn't limited if the guy can only run a certain package of offensive passing plays just yet.
Yeah, it's interesting because we all point to Trey Lance and the lack of starts. I believe Trey Lance has started the same number of games as Mac Jones.
Yep.
It's just that Mac Jones has started them in the last year, and Trey Lance started them 2 years ago when he was younger.
So I'll push back on that slightly, though, because I think I've seen the stat that Trevor Lawrence threw more touchdowns in high school than Lance threw pass attempts, period. So, I think from a bigger picture perspective, he really is less experienced as a quarterback.
Right. But he did play in a more pro-style offense, right? I mean, he was under center more. He did more of the kind of things. Like San Francisco is a team that's lower percentage of shotgun. So I would think my guess is Garoppolo starts the year for San Francisco. My guess is Cam Newton starts the year for New England. I'm pretty sure Fields comes in after Chicago first has their bye week. I'm not sure when Lance and Jones start playing.
Yeah, for Mac Jones, for me, I almost feel like this is just going to depend on whether Cam Newton's shoulder makes any sort of bounce back. I know it's been a couple of years since he initially suffered that injury, and last year it didn't look any better than it did the year before. But, shoulders are always finicky, weird things. If he can kind of get the ball out there at all, it wouldn't stun me if he ended up starting for longer than all of these other current incumbents.
So
I agree.
What quarterback should be the first one to be drafted in fantasy this year?
So I'm going to say it's Trevor Lawrence. You obviously get the boost from the fact that he's going to be the day one starter. But another thing that I'll point out is even though he's not Fields or Lance, he did run 16.9% of his plays in college, ran in 18 touchdowns in 3 seasons for Clemson. So I think you're kind of getting a little bit of a dual threat, maybe, along the lines of some of the Joe Burrow types, probably even a little bit better than that. He's 6'6" and 213 pounds. So really could be a little bit of a threat in the red zone, but I think that's going to help him get a little boost there. And I subscribe to maybe the not quite consensus opinion that Lawrence could be a generational type of prospect where maybe it's fair to actually expect an Andrew Luck type of entrance into the league where is 30 touchdowns out of the questions this year? I don't think so. I think he could be a borderline top 10 quarterback.
And they've got weapons. They've got Chark. They've got Laviska Shenault.
Mm-hmm.
Marvin Jones,
his teammate.
Yep. They've got Marvin Jones. They've got Etienne now. James Robinson. So they've got a good offense. I think, the thing that's going to keep Jacksonville a losing team is their defense more than their offense.
Not their coaching.
The defense as it pertains to the coaching.
I have no idea what to expect from their coaching.
Yeah, same. That was just a throwaway joke.
Urban Meyer can coach in the NFL. Right. I have no idea.
I kind of go with the Chip Kelly paradigm where it starts out phenomenal and then spends 3 years slowly deteriorating. And I can kind of see that happening here where it's look how explosive this is. Look how good our quarterback is. Expect the unexpected. And then all the realities of day-to-day stuff that destroyed the Eagles could slip in.
Because on one hand, there's scheme design, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But then there's also personality management.
Yes.
And dealing with the media.
Yeah.
And there's a number of things in the NFL that are different than college. The scheme design is actually college is there's differences in the college game and, where the hash marks are and the difference between the best and worst player on the field, and rushing is more important in the college game, etc. But I would think that the scheme design and would translate better than the personality management and locker room management type stuff.
Right. And getting used to the fact that there's a players union.
Right.
And getting used to the fact there's a salary cap, and you can't just get all the 5-star recruits you can possibly get, and somebody's going to tell you no. And, I keep looking at Meyer, looking at him from a personality standpoint, his background and things I've heard from people who've dealt with him. And I'm stuck between that feeling that he's going to be sort of a Chip Kelly, and the more he's there, the more he's getting on people's nerves, or if he's going to be Spurrier. It's see ya, it's drizzling, I'm going to go play golf, I'm going to stay home. It's under 50 degrees, I don't practice. And I don't know, I'm getting the idea that either of those are possibly on the table. I don't see Jimmy Johnson where he's actually going to come in and change the way the NFL does business.
So there are reasons you could advocate for Zach Wilson over Trevor Lawrence. I think, the Jets are greatly improved as well. Obviously, grabbed Mekhi Becton last year, added another offensive lineman to help protect him, has some, improving skill talent, and also actually ran the ball more in college than even Trevor Lawrence did, 20.2% rushing ratio. But I'm going to say the fact that he's 6'2", 214, to me, noticeably smaller, makes me have to think that the Jets are probably going to ask him to run a little bit less to keep him upright, especially if maybe the Jets aren't necessarily a Super Bowl contender in their first season. So I think that maybe his rushing success won't translate quite as well to the next level. I'm glad I cracked up Mike there a little bit, but his rushing may not translate as well as the other three big prospects here, which obviously from a fantasy perspective means he may be a longer term fantasy option.
Imagine that all 5 of them are starting week 1.
Yeah.
What order would you put them in for fantasy purposes?
So this gets harder for me because the more that I pay attention to football, the less I feel confident projecting which quarterbacks are actually going to be good at football, which is obviously important. But I'm still going to lean Trevor Lawrence 1, just because of everything you read about his chances to be a great and immediately impactful passer. But if they're all starting, I would probably skip over Wilson and then go Trey Lance and then Justin Fields next before I hit Wilson. And I think that's the order I would go with. The 49ers have a very quarterback-friendly offense. You guys have mentioned, Lance could just throw the ball to running backs and to Deebo Samuel and Jalen Hurd, who might as well be running backs. And he could have a lot of fantasy points without actually taking on a lot of responsibility.
Oh, the mythical Jalen Hurd.
I almost he's still here.
Brandon Ayuk, whoever you want it to be. They're all kind of a similar skill set.
He's a unicorn. The Hurts is man, the 6'5" all-purpose. I'm guessing you think he's going to be Cordarrelle Patterson at some point. It's oh wow, this is a great return man who can catch a screen pass or whatever. But it's if you take Cordarrelle Patterson and you injure him a bunch of times and you take a little bit of the talent off and you do one more thing to him, you're at this mythical creature called Jalen Hurd.
All right, just thanks for folks who are tuning in on the Twitch stream. If you're just joining us, we're talking about the NFL Draft with Scott Spratt and Mike Tanier from Football Outsiders. This is the new Football Outsiders radio hour every Thursday at 1 o'clock during the offseason, 1 o'clock Eastern. Let's get to the running backs. We'll start with Najee Harris. See, here's the thing now, because we're talking about fantasy purposes, we can get rid of the whole whether running backs matter or not debate.
They do to us.
And
That's
whether
right.
you should draft them early. Because once we're talking about fantasy purposes, they were drafted, they're on these teams. We don't have to talk about whether they should have been drafted later. Let's just talk about how good they're going to be and how much they're going to play. And we'll start with Najee Harris because he's the clear starter. He's the one running back drafted this year who clearly starts the year as the starter.
Yeah, from an NFL draft perspective, I think there would probably be people in the Najee Harris camp and people in the Travis Etienne camp of who is the better player or better pick. But now that we know where they are from a fantasy perspective, I think it's obvious that Harris is the better option. Lands with the Steelers, I think pretty clearly is going to be their lead and workhorse player. Benny Snell last year, negative 26.3% rushing DVOA. James Conner out of town in Arizona at this point. So I think taking over, maybe in my mind, the only running back with the chance for 250 carries in his first year here. First, he's got the size to do that, 6'1", 232 pounds. So that's probably good news for him in the red zone as well. but also important from a fantasy perspective, 11.1% receiving ratio, really made strides as a receiver last year to the point where I think that's going to really sort of boost his floor. Because the thing that you're worried about is that the Steelers ranked 32nd in adjusted line yards last season, and maybe it wasn't James Conner and Benny Snell's fault that they did so badly. But hopefully Harris is going to be able to push the pile, and even if he can't to a great extent, he'll be able to catch the ball out of the backfield, and I think that's going to boost his value in fantasy, even if it's more volume and he's only carrying it for like 3.9 yards per carry.
To explain to people who might be new to Football Outsiders, adjusted line yards is a stat that separates runs at different distances to determine how well the offensive line is blocking, separate to what the running backs get when they break away from the line and go, with a really long highlight run. And yeah, the Steelers, who have had a really good offensive line for a really long time, it finally has really broken down over the last few years. And now Pouncey's retired and Villanueva's gone, and
in Baltimore, biggest rival there. That's good.
And their line is not as good as it used to be, and he's not going to get the blocking that Pittsburgh running backs used to get.
Also, there will be 12 defenders in the box because Ben Roethlisberger cannot throw more than 5 yards down the field without a running start.
Well, that's great.
It was actually
Harris
funny
can catch 5-yard passes. That's ideal for fantasy.
A lot of screens. Yeah, a lot of opportunities for Chase Claypool and Deontay Johnson and everybody else like that. It was funny watching the Steelers hardcore fans on Twitter come around to the reality as the week went on last year. Like, how dare you? This is all narrative. We're doing great. Roethlisberger's fine. His arm's fine. Everything's fine. And then that losing streak, and it was like, oh. Like, yeah, this is what you guys got now, quarterback. But I look at Harris as possibly having that Saquon Barkley rookie season, because I think he catches the ball almost as well as Barkley does now that he's really taken that leap forward. And whatever happens 2 or 3 years down the road, he can have that season where he's out there leaping over guys, breaking tackles, and having big numbers for fantasy.
Who you got second for running backs in fantasy value now? Are we going to talk about Javonte Williams in Denver or Travis Etienne in Jacksonville?
Yeah, so I may need Mike to sort of take the scout's perspective on this and tell me if I'm getting carried away, but I have Javonte Williams over Travis Etienne based on landing spot. Part of this is that I just really like James Robinson. Like, I know he was an undrafted player, but very successful last year, and beyond even the counting stats, 19% broken tackle rate, was 15th of 39 running backs with 150 or more touches. 2.58 yards after contact per attempt, was 9th of 51 running backs with 100 plus carries. So to me, like, he's the much more natural fit as an every down player. And I don't know what to think with Urban Meyer saying stuff like Etienne is going to be a third down back for them to start with, because the guy can't block by all accounts. But Javonte Williams, I mean, it's not a perfectly clean situation because he's landing with the Broncos where Melvin Gordon still is. But Melvin Gordon, negative DVOA as a rusher in 5 of his 6 career NFL seasons. I don't think it's quite as entrenched here as you might expect. Plus, Phillip Lindsay out of town. That's 118 carries that are vacated here. And Williams, I know that Backcast didn't love the fact that he and Michael Carter split time in North Carolina. And I kind of buy into that logic a little bit that, usually in those situations, these players probably aren't both really great NFL prospects. Right. But Williams checks a lot of the fantasy boxes that you want to see, with the broken tackle rates, with the good size, 5'10", 212 pounds. And the 12.0% receiving ratio, that's similar to Travis Etienne. I think he can catch the ball a little bit. And even if it's not necessarily the catch it and then run 60 yards to the house type of thing, just catching those passes, especially in PPR leagues, I think could be a big boost for his value. Mike, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I didn't personally, but I know a lot of people had Javonte Williams ranked equal to or above Etienne, really love Javonte Williams. I worry about both Williams and Carter because, I sat there and watched that Miami game. And they combined for 537 yards or something like that in the Miami game. And I was just like, I don't know what I'm looking at. Was Miami, were they quarantined in a hotel for 2 weeks, with no air conditioning? What was this? But yeah, if you take that out of it, it's like, well, I'm not sure how great these players even are. That said, yeah, I had Williams as he can be like a James Conner type impact guy. Not Conner we saw last year, who was playing pretty poorly overall, but the guy we saw when he first came out, kind of made everybody say Le'Veon Bell, who really powerful guy, can catch the short passes and get some yak out of it. Like you said, not 60-yard passes, but these rumbles where you're getting 10, 15 yards at the pop. I can see him in a 1-2 punch in Denver. One thing I'm going to take it back to you is, do I see Michael Carter possibly at the top of the depth chart for the New York Jets now?
I mean, it's hard not to look at it that way. Their incumbent options are LaMichael Perrin, who was a 4th rounder last year, so not necessarily a top prospect.
Right.
Tevin Coleman coming in from San Francisco. Been successful.
He just got hurt. You mentioned his name. He got hurt. So.
Yeah, I mean, really. Been successful from a deficiency standpoint a bunch of times in his career. Never had more than 170 carries in a season. Missed most of last year, as you said. You got Ty Johnson, the former 6th rounder, has been released a couple of times. It's hard not to look at Carter as sort of the top guy here. And one thing that I'll say is that even though 199 pounds sounds very, very small for a running back, he's also 5'8". So from like a BMI perspective, it's actually not that bad. 30.3 there. Wouldn't be stunning for me to see him get in the like 200 touch category. Yeah. And frankly, there just aren't very many running backs that do better than that anymore. Like maybe Najee Harris can, but that's not going to prevent Carter from being a top 15 or 20, fantasy option, especially given that his 13.8% receiving ratio, kind of like reminiscent of a James White, coming out of college, that type of workload. And maybe he won't get pigeonholed to that same extent, given that his backfield is a little bit, less crowded than maybe White got drafted into.
And the Jets offensive line, they're really building a nice offensive line there with Becton and Elijah Vera Tucker, the guy they took in the 2nd round this year. And I think there's no reason why LaMichael Perrin is going to start. So unless they're going to start Tevin Coleman, I have a feeling it would be Michael Carter as the starter. But there's probably going to be a lot of split there. So I doubt he's going to be like a top 20 fantasy running back. But
you could see them being down, 27-10 in the 4th quarter and throwing, 8-9 passes over the middle to their running back too late in games and just like racking up PPR for Yak. If that's what Carter winds up getting to do.
The 49ers drafted 2 running backs, which I just scratch my head. I don't think they needed any running back because they had Mostert, Gallman, Wilson, and Hasty, and now they drafted 2 more running backs. Are we going to see any of Trey Sermon or?
Yeah, so I think Sermon is a lot more likely to make an impact as a fantasy player than Elijah Mitchell, because Mitchell is sort of that classic speedy Kyle Shanahan player where there is major logjam ahead of him. But, with Sermon being the bigger player, 6 foot, 215 pounds, maybe more the classic between the tackles type of runner, maybe Jeff Wilson is the only player in front of him on the depth chart that's like obviously in his way. So like maybe Sermon could have 125 carries this year and then like get some work at the goal line to make him an option. But I think it probably makes more sense to treat him like a handcuff in fantasy than somebody that's going to like clearly be an impact guy. I'm just not sure this running back class has as many immediate impact runners as we've seen in some previous seasons.
And then the other guy who I know you've mentioned as a possible sleeper is Kenneth Gainwell from the Eagles. What is his deal? 5th round pick.
5th round pick, another player who I think size contributed to his slide in the draft. He's 201 pounds, but another 5'8" guy. So the BMI not quite as bad as you would expect, but 19.5% receiving ratio. I'm not sure if the entire class is this, but like more or less led the class in that respect. So I'm wondering if he may be the type of running back that gets some work in the slot and maybe could be a PPR option, and especially landing with the Eagles, a team that's kind of taken some non-traditional players of the Darren Sproles ilk and turned them into real fantasy options for you, even if it's, it's a lot more catches than actual carries.
All right. Before we ask you about wide receivers to end the show, Kyle Pitts, tight ends, notoriously bad as rookies.
Yes.
Is Kyle Pitts draftable because he's the highest drafted tight end ever in the regular NFL draft? Is he fantasy worthy, or is he going to have another one of these first years like?
So, I mean, he's absolutely draftable from a fantasy perspective. And the major reason for that is even though year 1 tight ends aren't good, I would say that tight ends in general aren't good for fantasy. I mean, you have the odd exception of your Travis Kelce and your George Kittle, but it's just maybe there are 5 guys that you can count on. But then beyond that, it's just a crapshoot. And so I'm not going to
take the chance.
Yeah, I'm not going to be upset if you go for him. But the reason for pessimism, I mean, there's several. One, even the top drafted tight ends from recent seasons haven't done anything in the rookie years. TJ Hawkinson, 367 yards, 2 touchdowns. OJ Howard, 432 and 6. Eric Ebron, North Carolina legend, 248 and 1. So like, unless you're Gronk and you can catch 10 touchdowns on 42 catches in a season, it's not that promising. Plus Hayden Hurst still on the team, still had 88 targets last year. The DVOA was down versus Baltimore, but kind of in range with a lot of other guys. Like, I think it's going to be a split workload there. So you can draft him as a sleeper, but like, I wouldn't count on him as being a top 5 option at the position by any stretch.
All right, wide receivers. Who do you like? Who's the best wide receiver for fantasy purposes?
So there are 2 possibilities here. I think I'll lean towards Jamar Chase, landing with the Bengals with his former quarterback in Joe Burrow. Obviously, the top drafted guy, so that kind of leans you toward the optimism there, was exceptionally productive his last season with Burrow in 2019, 1780 yards and 20 touchdowns for that juggernaut LSU team. But like the major question here is whether he can immediately become the number 1 option over Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins. And, I'm a little bit cautious there, because if you look at their full season efficiency numbers, Boyd negative 6.2% receiving DVOA, Higgins 3.9%. But if you isolate to just when Joe Burrow was healthy, those numbers jump up to 6.2% and 12.7%. So I actually kind of like this whole group. And so if you like made me power rank it from a fantasy perspective, I would lean more on Burrow to take advantage of all of that. But I can't get away from the fact that AJ Green is vacating 104 targets. And I think that probably gives him a chance, even if it actually will be 3 receivers making an impact here. And then the other guy that I think is in the mix is actually Devontae Smith, not his former teammate Jalen Waddle, because I think Smith landed in a better spot for a fantasy perspective with the Eagles. And, it's not great that Jalen Hurts runs the ball so much. I think it's probably unlikely to be a high volume passing offense with him at quarterback. But Travis Fulgham is the only returning Eagles wide receiver that did better than negative 10% receiving DVOA last year. And that includes Jalen Reagor, their last year's top pick. Like, they didn't draft Justin Jefferson, so now Smith is the guy. That's kind of how I see it. What do you think, Mike?
I tend to agree there. I mean, I am kind of worried about the entire Eagles offense. I don't know what's going to come out of that. And I look at, as much as I like these wide receivers, I look at them and I get so nervous from a fantasy standpoint. It's like, okay, I think Devontae Smith's going to be the number 1 guy. What if this entire offense falls apart? I don't think he's going to be somebody. I think he's going to be like a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4.
Yeah.
And I agree with everything you said about Jamar Chase. He wound up having a very productive season as part of a group, a committee, et cetera. So I actually look at Bateman to a degree. Not that somebody I would take as a starter, but as somebody who'd be like, yeah, what if he's a guy who's doing, 651 and helps me in PPR? I actually look at, I don't think Kadarius Toney is going to do a lot fantasy wise, but it's like, what if this is a guy that is catching a bunch of underneath passes and running the ball 3 or 4 times a game in different things? So I don't think that there are players in Devontae Smith's class. I don't think there are players in Waddle's class, but they're guys who could turn around and, because of the way their offenses are structured, wind up having, bigger season statistically.
Waddle has a lot more competition. Waddle has a lot more competition for targets because there's still Devontae Parker, Will Fuller, Preston Williams, and Mike Gesicki.
Yeah, that's a lot there. And I don't know how their offense is going to look. I don't know how that's going to be structured there in Miami as well. I'd be more comfortable with Tua going forward than I am with Hurts going forward. But there's still a possibility there that that's a team that's spreading the ball about and running the ball out more. They got Kareem Hunt now. And that could be one of their emphases to try and be more run-oriented.
Yeah, Will Fuller is with Miami for just a 1-year deal. So this may be a situation where Waddle is going to come along a little bit more slowly.
Yeah.
But then from a dynasty perspective, may end up being more valuable than, say, Smith could be. But year 1, I don't love it.
And they're all real good from dynasty. I think that's a different situation altogether.
Absolutely. These receivers all shoot to the top of the board from a dynasty perspective. When from a redraft perspective, looking just at 2021, I'm not necessarily in love with any of them, and I would probably rather grab, especially Najee Harris, but maybe a running back or 2.
Yeah.
Which do you think of? We talked about some of these other wide receivers: Elijah Moore, Terrace Mitchell, Rondale Moore, Amari Rodgers.
A lot of these players, to me, have a chance to have value, but there's a contingency. So, like with Elijah Moore for the Jets, I think his value is contingent on the Jets releasing slot receiver Jamison Crowder, which could happen because it would save them $10 million in cap space. But Crowder led the team with 7.4 targets per game last season and probably butts up against where Moore would play in the slot. But possibility there with Amari Rodgers with the Packers, obviously that's going to be contingent on whether Aaron Rodgers is back with the Packers. But if that does happen, I mean, you have to be excited, right? I mean, He's basically Randall Cobb come again. This is one of the bigger complaints that Aaron Rodgers has had about the team, kind of neglecting a spot that they finally filled now that Aaron demands to be traded.
Aaron Rodgers, we got you Amari Rodgers, exactly what you wanted, and we even had it engraved for you with your name. And the other Moore, I get the Moores mixed up. The one that went to Arizona,
Yes.
the littler guy from Purdue, the short guy.
Rondale Moore from Purdue.
Yes.
He's another one that it's like, well, what if Kingsbury really opens up this offense with these 3 million little screens and bubble screens and tunnel screens, who can wind up getting a lot of touches, targets. Yeah, it's underneath stuff, but if that's where you're getting your fantasy value, and it's like, oh yeah, he had 7 for 50 because they're just feeding him screen passes and they're running reverses, shovels and things like that. He is a real fun guy to watch. I like him as a number 2 or 3 when you already have Nuke there taking care of business, and I think he could be an interesting producer as well.
The contingency there is Larry Fitzgerald going to retire, right? Because that's 72 targets in the balance, and a guy that sort of migrated to the slot as he's gotten older. That could be a little bit of a playing time conundrum there.
Yeah,
he's not good no more.
Speaking of
he
slot,
don't play good no more.
Amon-Ra St. Brown, I think, in a deeper league that does PPR, he could be a guy for Detroit because he basically goes right into the starting slot receiver position. Their wide receiver depth chart sucks.
It's barren, and I'm gonna this is a reckless thing to do because they're not quite the same player, but Cooper Kupp, 62 catches, 869 yards and 5 touchdowns in his rookie season, which was Jared Goff's breakout 2017 season as a second-year player. Slot receivers can often slip further in the draft because they can't do everything you would want from a receiver from an NFL perspective, but sometimes those are the players that make the more immediate impact as rookies. So from a fantasy perspective, I can absolutely see him as being a viable sleeper.
And sometimes you discover that they were slot receivers in college because they were worried about the quarterback being able to get to throw the ball to the boundaries. So they would just put speed guys out there. And this was a more multifaceted person that they could get the ball to by keeping him near the hash mark.
Yeah, and St. Brown probably is potentially more versatile than just a stick him in the slot guy like Kupp might be. But with Tyrell Williams and Brashad Perryman are obviously outside receivers. Right. So that may be the developmental path, which could be good for fantasy.
They're seriously talking about those names as the Lions receivers coming out of a draft with this many receivers. Unbelievable.
I still can't believe we're talking about the name Amon-Ra St. Brown as a name of a human being. So
that's Equinemius' brother. I don't know if you know that.
Brother,
and their father was Mr. Universe.
So you love that. Didn't make it to the NFL.
Yes, Osiris.
All right, let's wrap it up. This has been the Football Outsiders Radio Hour. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on Twitch. Again, I'm going to remind you, the Football Outsiders Radio Hour, not on the radio, not exactly an hour, here on Twitch, every Thursday, 1 o'clock Eastern Time, 10 o'clock Pacific. Your chance to ask us questions in the chat. Cochlea likes to thank Scott for making use of John Oliver's White Void during the week.
Is that my background situation?
Yes. Here I am doing my show from this White Void.
This is my very high decorating budget, so just have to play here.
John wasn't using it, so you borrowed it for the week. Mike and I have books in the background. You're in John Oliver's Black Void.
One of you needs to teach me how to use the digital Zoom background so I can act like I'm somewhere interesting other than my dining room right now.
Oh, we totally know how to do that. This show started with us all muted, so we are down to put the background up on Zoom.
That concludes this episode of Old Men Using Social Media.
Join us next week when we have a better idea of how to use Twitch. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for tuning in. And we'll see you next Thursday for the Football Outsiders Radio Hour.